Over 60,000 people were watching live, when a flight attendant slapped a young mother across the face and cheered. What none of them knew was that the woman they just humiliated wasn't an ordinary passenger. She was the CEO's wife. You know, sometimes the most important moments in history don't happen in boardrooms or courtrooms. Sometimes they happen in the most ordinary places. Like a Tuesday afternoon, on a plane at Atlanta's Hartsfield-Jackson Airport, where a young mother was about to teach the world a lesson it would never forget. Her name was Alyssa Morgan, and if you'd seen her that day, you probably wouldn't have looked twice. She was just another passenger, a tired-looking woman in her late 20s, wearing comfortable jeans and a simple sweater, carrying a baby bag over one shoulder and cradling her 6-month-old daughter, Luna, against her chest. Nothing about her screamed important. Nothing about her demanded attention. And maybe that's exactly why what happened next was so devastating. Alyssa had checked in for her flight like everyone else. She'd gone through security, bought a bottle of water, and made her way to the gate. Her boarding pass had a small gold symbol printed near the barcode, tiny, easy to miss if you weren't looking for it. It was a private status code, the kind airlines use internally. Most passengers wouldn't even know what it meant. But the flight crew should have. When Alyssa boarded the plane, she turned left. First class. She found her seat, 3A, window side, and settled in carefully, adjusting Luna's blanket, making sure everything was within reach. The diaper bag went under the seat. Her phone stayed in her hand. And that boarding pass, with its little gold symbol, she tucked under her palm on the armrest. Around her, the first-class cabin was filling up. Businessmen in expensive suits. A couple celebrating an anniversary. A tech executive typing furiously on his laptop. These were people who flew first class because they paid for it, because they expected it, because they felt they deserved it. And when they saw Alyssa, young, casually dressed, with a baby, some of them frowned. You could see it in their eyes. That look. That quick judgment. How did she end up here? Nobody said anything. Not yet. But the energy in the cabin shifted, just slightly. Like a string pulled a little too tight. For the first 20 minutes, everything was fine. Alyssa rocked Luna gently, whispering to her, keeping her calm. The flight attendants moved through the cabin, checking overhead bins, offering pre-departure drinks. One of them, her name tag read Claire Dawson, barely glanced at Alyssa as she passed. And then, as the cabin doors closed and the captain made the announcement about preparing for departure, Luna started to cry. Not loud at first. Just fussing, the way babies do. But in the pressurized quiet of first class, where people were used to hushed conversations and the gentle clinking of champagne glasses, even a baby's small cry felt like an invasion. Alyssa immediately shifted into action. She adjusted Luna's position, checked her diaper, offered a pacifier. She was doing everything right, everything any good mother would do. But Luna was 6 months old. She couldn't understand that she needed to be quiet for the strangers around her. She just knew she was uncomfortable, and she cried. That's when Claire Dawson reappeared. "Ma'am," she said, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. "You need to keep your baby quiet. This is first class." Alyssa looked up, surprised by the tone. "I'm trying," she said softly. "She's just a little fussy. It'll pass." "Other passengers are complaining," Claire said, though no one had actually said a word. "If you can't control her, maybe you should move to the back of the plane." There it was. That suggestion. Move to the back. Where you belong. Alyssa's jaw tightened, but her voice stayed calm. "I have an assigned seat. We'll be fine." She turned her attention back to Luna, rocking her, humming quietly. Around them, passengers were watching now. Some looked sympathetic. But others looked annoyed. Inconvenienced. Like this young mother and her crying baby were ruining their $200 upgrade. "Some people just don't understand first-class etiquette," someone whispered behind her. Claire walked away, but her body language was pure frustration. She disappeared into the galley, and Alyssa could hear her talking to another crew member, her voice carrying just enough to be heard. "I don't know how she even got up here. Probably some mistake with the booking system. People like that always think they can sneak into first class." People like that. Alyssa heard it. She heard every word. But she didn't respond. She just kept rocking Luna, kept whispering to her daughter, kept her eyes down. Her hand rested on that boarding pass, covering the gold symbol that could have ended all of this with a single word. But she didn't say that word. Not yet. 5 minutes passed. Luna's crying wasn't getting worse, but it wasn't stopping either. She was tired, overstimulated, uncomfortable in the unfamiliar environment. And then Claire Dawson came back. This time, she wasn't alone. Another flight attendant stood behind her, arms crossed, backing her up. "Ma'am, I'm going to have to ask you one more time." "I'm doing my best," Alyssa said, and for the first time, there was an edge in her voice. Not anger, just exhaustion. "She's a baby. She's going to cry sometimes." "Not in my cabin, she's not," Claire snapped. And that's when it happened. Claire Dawson reached out, fast, impulsive, angry, and slapped Alyssa across the face. The sound echoed through the cabin like a gunshot. For a moment, everything stopped. Time itself seemed to freeze. Alyssa's head turned from the impact, her cheek already reddening. Luna's cries got louder, startled by the sudden movement. And all around them, 50 passengers sat in complete shock. But here's the thing about shock, it doesn't last. And when it broke, it didn't break in Alyssa's favor. A few people gasped. Someone said, "Oh my God." But then, almost immediately, phones came out. Not to help Alyssa. Not to call for security to protect her. No, to record what they thought was going to be a viral video of an entitled passenger getting what she deserved. Because that's what they saw. A flight attendant, in uniform, taking control of a difficult situation. A young mother who must have done something to provoke it. Someone who didn't belong. Finally, a man in 4C muttered. Someone standing up to these entitled parents. A woman across the aisle nodded approvingly. And just like that, the narrative was set. Alyssa was the problem. Not the person who hit her. Not the crew member who had just committed assault in front of witnesses. Her. The young mother. The woman with the crying baby. The woman who didn't look like she belonged in first class. Alyssa's hand went to her cheek. It was stinging, hot, painful. But her expression didn't change. She didn't yell. Didn't cry. Didn't make a scene. She just adjusted Luna's blanket with trembling fingers and kept rocking her daughter. Her silence was unnerving. Claire seemed to take it as submission. "Control your screaming child," Claire said, loud enough for everyone to hear, "or I'll have security remove you both from this aircraft." A few passengers actually applauded. That's when Captain Robert Hayes entered the cabin. He was a veteran pilot, 22 years with the airline, thousands of flights under his belt. He looked authoritative in his uniform, the kind of person you'd trust to get you safely from point A to point B. But here's what you need to understand about authority. It can be used to protect, or it can be used to punish. And Captain Hayes had already decided which side he was on. "Ma'am," he said, his voice cold and official, "federal regulations require passengers to comply with flight crew instructions. If you cannot do that, you will be removed from this flight." Alyssa looked up at him, really looked at him, and in that moment, something passed between them, some wordless communication that only she understood. She glanced at her phone. 7 minutes until scheduled departure. 7 minutes until the doors would close and the plane would push back from the gate. 7 minutes until everything changed. Meanwhile, in the back of the cabin, a college student named Marcus had been filming the whole thing. Not on his phone's camera app, on TikTok. Live. Streaming everything in real time to whoever wanted to watch. When the slap happened, his viewer count jumped from a few dozen to a few hundred. By the time Captain Hayes showed up, it was at 18,000. And the comments? They were brutal. Finally, a flight attendant with a backbone. That mom looks like nothing but trouble. Good for the crew. People need to learn respect. If you can't control your kid, don't fly first class. 18,000 people, watching live, taking the side of the flight attendant who had just assaulted a passenger. Air marshals appeared from somewhere in the back. Airport security stood by at the jet bridge entrance. What had started as a crying baby on a Tuesday afternoon flight was now a full-blown incident, broadcast live to thousands of people, spiraling out of control by the second. Captain Hayes crossed his arms. "You have 30 seconds to comply, or you're off this plane." Claire folded her arms, smug and satisfied. "This is exactly why we have rules," she said to another flight attendant, loud enough for Alyssa to hear. "People like her always try to play the victim." The entire cabin was watching. judging, waiting. And Alyssa Morgan, quiet, calm, still cradling her crying daughter, took a slow, deep breath. Then she picked up her phone and made a call. "Hey, sweetheart," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm having some trouble on your airline." The man who answered spoke with a voice that was calm, controlled, and absolutely dangerous. "Which aircraft, Alyssa?" he said. "I'll handle it." Captain Hayes froze mid-step. Claire Dawson's smug expression faltered. Because that voice was one every single Atlas Air employee knew by heart. It belonged to Jonathan Morgan, Chief Executive Officer of Atlas Air, and the woman they'd just humiliated, assaulted, and tried to throw off the plane. She was his wife. You know that feeling when you realize you've made a terrible mistake? When your stomach drops and your mouth goes dry, and every cell in your body is screaming at you that you've just done something you can never, ever take back. That's what was happening to Claire Dawson and Captain Robert Hayes in that moment. Except they didn't know it yet. Not quite. Not until Alyssa put her phone on speaker. "Which aircraft, Alyssa?" The voice filled the cabin. Calm. Measured. But underneath that calm was something else. Something that made grown men take a step back. It was the kind of voice that didn't need to yell to be terrifying. The kind of voice that moved mountains with a whisper. "I'll handle it," he said. And suddenly, the entire energy of that first-class cabin shifted. You could feel it, like the air pressure changing before a storm. Captain Hayes' confident stance wavered. Claire's smug expression started to crack around the edges. Because they knew that voice. Every pilot who'd ever flown for Atlas Air knew it. Every flight attendant who'd been through training knew it. Every gate agent, every mechanic, every person who'd ever collected a paycheck with that company's logo on it. They all knew that voice. Jonathan Morgan, CEO of Atlas Air. But here's the thing, knowing someone's voice and understanding what it means are two very different things. And in that moment, as recognition spread through the crew like wildfire, they were all trying to do the math. Trying to figure out why the CEO of their airline was on the phone with this woman. This young mother in casual clothes with a crying baby. This person they'd decided didn't belong. An older flight attendant in the galley went pale. "Oh God," she whispered. That's Morgan." Alyssa's voice stayed soft, almost apologetic, like she was sorry to bother him. "Flight 2447 out of Atlanta. We're still at the gate." "Put me on video," Jonathan said. She switched to FaceTime, and when that screen flipped around so everyone could see, the cabin collectively held its breath. There he was, Jonathan Morgan, not calling from home, not calling from a car. He was in a boardroom. A massive boardroom with floor-to-ceiling windows showing the Atlanta skyline. And behind him, filling the leather chairs around a conference table, were a dozen executives. Vice presidents, operations directors, the head of legal, the entire leadership team of Atlas Air. And they were all watching. Jonathan's face was calm, but his eyes were fire. "This is Jonathan Morgan," he said, his voice now echoing through Alyssa's phone speaker for the entire cabin to hear. "CEO of Atlas Air. I need everyone on that aircraft to listen very carefully." 180 passengers went silent. Even Luna seemed to sense the shift, her cries fading to small whimpers. "Step away from my wife and child. Now. My wife." Those two words hit the cabin like a physical force. You could see it ripple through the passengers, the realization, the horror, the sudden understanding that they'd all been part of something terrible. Captain Hayes stumbled backward. His face had gone from authoritative red to ash gray in seconds. Claire Dawson's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes wide with the kind of panic that comes when you realize your entire life is about to change. On Marcus's TikTok livestream, the viewer count exploded. 25,000, 30,000, 42,000 people watching in real time as this story took a turn nobody saw coming. The comments section was going absolutely insane. "Wait, what? She's the CEO's wife. Oh my God, they're so fired. Y'all, I can't breathe, this is insane. That flight attendant is done. This is the craziest thing I've ever seen live." Jonathan's voice cut through the chaos. "Captain Hayes." Hayes jumped like he'd been electrocuted. "Sir, Be quiet," Jonathan said, and Hayes's mouth snapped shut. "Ms. Dawson." Claire made a sound that might have been words, but came out more like a whimper. "I want both of you to understand something," Jonathan continued. His voice was still calm, eerily calm. I've just watched the last 10 minutes of footage from multiple angles. My security team is reviewing it right now. And what I saw was a flight attendant, one of my flight attendants, physically assault my wife while she was holding our infant daughter. He paused, letting that sink in. In the boardroom behind him, you could see executives on their phones, typing frantically on laptops. The head of legal was already writing notes. Sir, I can explain, Claire started. Explain what? Jonathan's voice dropped even lower. Explain the rule that allows a flight attendant to strike a passenger? Please, Ms. Dawson. Show me that rule. I'll wait. Silence. Complete, suffocating silence. Because there was no rule. There never had been. What Claire had done wasn't procedure. It wasn't protocol. It wasn't even close to legal. It was assault. Plain and simple. Captured on camera from multiple angles. Witnessed by 50 people in person and broadcast live to over 42,000 more online. I want you to understand the severity of what's happening right now, Jonathan said. The young man in seat 18B who's been live streaming this? His video has been viewed by 42,000 people. And counting. Every major news outlet is going to have this footage within the hour. The Department of Transportation will see it. The FAA will see it. The FBI will see it, because assault on an aircraft is a federal crime. Claire's knees buckled. She grabbed the seat back to keep from falling. But here's what really matters, Jonathan continued, and now his voice had an edge that could cut steel. My wife was assaulted while holding our 6-month-old daughter. That's not just assault, Ms. Dawson. That's child endangerment. You struck a woman holding an infant. Do you have any idea what could have happened if she dropped Luna? If the baby had hit the armrest or the floor? Alyssa sat perfectly still through all of this, one hand on Luna's back, the other holding the phone. Her cheek was still red from the slap. She hadn't said a word. She didn't need to. Her silence was more powerful than any speech could have been. Captain Hayes, Jonathan said, turning his attention to the pilot. You witnessed an assault on a passenger and not only failed to intervene, you threatened to remove the victim from the aircraft. You sided with your crew over federal law, over basic human decency. I was just trying to support my team, Hayes stammered. Your team committed a crime, Jonathan said flatly, and you became an accessory to it. One of the executives in the boardroom leaned forward, whispered something to Jonathan. He nodded. I've just been informed, he said, that our internal review has pulled your files. Captain Hayes, you have 7 formal discrimination complaints filed against you in the last 8 years. 7. Do you know how much money Atlas Air has paid out in settlements because of your behavior? $2.3 million. We've been covering for you, quietly handling complaints, hoping you'd change. That ends today. Hayes looked like he might throw up. Ms. Dawson, you have 3 written warnings in your personnel file for racially biased remarks toward passengers. 3. And here's what I find particularly disturbing. We have audio recordings from the cabin. Not just from the live stream. From our own internal systems. Would you like me to play them? Claire shook her head frantically, tears streaming down her face. I didn't think so, Jonathan said. But I'm going to share a few quotes anyway. For context. He looked down at something off-screen reading. Control your brat. People like you always sneak into first class. And my personal favorite, your baby daddy won't save you from federal law. A collective gasp went through the cabin. Because now it was all out in the open. The bias. The assumptions. The cruelty that had been lurking underneath the surface all along. For the record, Jonathan said, his voice cold as ice, I am Luna's father. I'm Alyssa's husband. And I absolutely will save her from people like you. Because unlike you, I actually understand federal law. Alyssa finally spoke, her voice quiet but steady. Jonathan, I'm okay. Luna's okay. I know, sweetheart, he said, and for just a moment his voice softened. But they're not going to be. He looked directly into the camera. Claire Dawson and Robert Hayes, you are both terminated, effective immediately. Security will escort you from the aircraft. You will not fly for Atlas Air again. You will not work in aviation again if I have anything to say about it. And trust me, I have a lot to say about it. Please, Claire sobbed. Please, I have a mortgage, I have bills. You should have thought about that before you assaulted a mother holding her baby, Jonathan said. Federal charges are being filed as we speak. Assault. child endangerment, civil rights violations. You'll be hearing from law enforcement very shortly. On the live stream, the comment count was climbing faster than anyone could read. Justice. This is the most satisfying thing I've ever seen. She stayed so calm the whole time, OMG. Power move of the century. That CEO is not playing around. The view count hit 50,000. Then 60,000. This wasn't just going viral. It was exploding across every platform. Twitter, Instagram, Reddit, YouTube. Everyone was sharing it, reposting it, commenting on it. Airport security entered the cabin, walking past the stunned passengers. Behind them came 2 FBI agents, because assault on an aircraft isn't just a crime, it's a federal crime. Claire Dawson, one of the agents said. She was crying too hard to answer. They took her arms gently but firmly, reading her rights as they escorted her off the plane. Captain Hayes tried one last time. Mr. Morgan, I have a family. So does my wife. Jonathan cut him off. So does every passenger on every flight you've ever treated with suspicion or contempt. Your license is being reviewed by the FAA. I'm personally requesting a full investigation into every complaint ever filed against you. You're done. As Hayes was led away, the cabin remained frozen. 180 people who had watched this unfold, many of whom had sided with the crew, now sat in their seats, realizing they'd been complicit in something horrible. Realizing they'd judged a woman based on nothing but appearances. Based on assumptions. Based on bias they didn't even know they had. An older woman in first class stood up, walked over to Alyssa. I'm so sorry, she said, her voice breaking. I'm so sorry. Others joined her, apologizing, ashamed, coming face to face with their own prejudices in the worst possible way. Alyssa looked up at them, still holding Luna. Thank you, she said quietly. But this isn't about me. This is about every mother who's been judged. Every passenger who's been profiled. Every person who's been treated like they don't belong, and had no CEO to call. Jonathan's face on the phone screen softened when he heard her say that. That's my wife, he said with unmistakable pride. That's why I married her. Alyssa, do you want to stay on the flight or should I send the car? We'll stay, she said. Luna needs to get home. Okay. A new captain and crew are on their way. They'll be there in 10 minutes. I'll stay on the line until you're safely in the air. And he did. For the next half hour, as a new crew boarded and apologized profusely, as the plane finally pushed back from the gate, as it taxied and took off into the Atlanta sky, Jonathan Morgan stayed on that video call, watching over his family. The live stream ended at 62 million views. 62 million people had watched, in real time, as justice was served. But here's the thing about justice, it's not the ending. It's just the beginning. Because what happened next would change everything. Here's what nobody tells you about viral moments, they fade. The internet moves on. Today's outrage becomes tomorrow's forgotten headline. Within a week, most stories disappear into the endless scroll of content, replaced by the next shocking video, the next controversy, the next thing to be angry about for 15 minutes. But every once in a while, something happens that doesn't fade. Something that becomes a turning point. A before and after. Flight 2447 was one of those moments. By the time Alyssa's plane landed that evening, the video had been viewed over 60 million times. It was on every news channel. CNN, Fox News, BBC, Al Jazeera. Every talk show was discussing it. Every newspaper had it on the front page. The hashtag Flight 2447 was trending #1 worldwide. But the real shockwave wasn't just about the video itself. It was about what the video represented, what it revealed. Because here's the uncomfortable truth. What happened to Alyssa wasn't unique. It was just the first time it had been captured so completely, so undeniably, with such a dramatic reversal. By midnight, Atlas Air's stock had dropped 9%. Shareholders were panicking. The board was in emergency session. And Jonathan Morgan was facing the biggest crisis of his career. Most CEOs, when faced with this kind of disaster, would have done what CEOs do. Minimize, control the narrative, settle quietly, make it go away. Pay off the victim, bury the story, move on. Jonathan did the opposite. Within 12 hours of the incident, he released a statement. Not a carefully worded PR response full of alleged incidents and ongoing investigations. A real statement, raw and honest. What happened to my wife and daughter yesterday was inexcusable, it read. But what's even more inexcusable is that it took this happening to my family for me to fully understand how deep these problems run in our industry. My wife had the privilege of being married to the CEO. She could make a phone call that changed everything. But how many passengers have experienced discrimination, bias, or worse, and had nobody to call? This ends now. Not with apologies. With action. The aviation industry held its breath. And then Jonathan did something revolutionary. 48 hours after Flight 2447, Atlas Air announced the Passenger Dignity Program. Not a committee. Not a study group. Not a 6-month review process. An actual, immediate, system-wide transformation. Every flight attendant, every pilot, every gate agent, everyone who worked for Atlas Air would undergo mandatory empathy and anti-bias training. Not optional. Not online modules you could click through without reading. Real, in-person training with real scenarios, real accountability. Zero tolerance for discrimination became policy. Not the kind of zero tolerance that companies claim but never enforce. Real consequences. First incident, immediate suspension and investigation. Second incident, termination. No exceptions. No quiet settlements. Everything reported publicly. A passenger bill of rights was created and posted in every aircraft cabin, every gate area, every airport where Atlas Air operated. Plain language, real protections, and a direct hotline to report violations that went straight to the CEO's office. But here's what made it truly different. Jonathan didn't just reform his own airline. He made the data public. Every discrimination complaint, every investigation outcome, every training session result. Complete transparency. If we're going to change, he said in a press conference, we need to be held accountable. Not just to our shareholders, to every person who trusts us with their safety and dignity. The response was immediate and divided. Some praised it, called it revolutionary, said it was about time someone in corporate leadership actually led. Others mocked it, called it performative, said it would never last, predicted the company would fold within a year from the cost and complexity. But Jonathan didn't care about the critics. He cared about the results. And the results came fast. Within a month, 3 more Atlas Air employees were terminated for discrimination. Not because there were suddenly more incidents, because people finally felt safe reporting them. Because there was finally a system that took them seriously. Within 2 months, discrimination complaints across the industry started dropping. Not just at Atlas Air, everywhere. Because other airlines saw what was happening. They saw Atlas Air's stock start to recover. They saw customers choosing Atlas Air specifically because of the reforms. They saw that doing the right thing could actually be good for business. Within 6 months, Delta announced similar policies. Then United. Then American. Then international carriers. The Passenger Dignity Program became the model that airlines around the world started adopting. But the real impact was in the stories that started coming out. Stories that had been buried for years. A black businessman who'd been questioned about his first-class ticket on 12 separate flights, and told himself each time that he was being too sensitive. A mother traveling alone with 3 kids who'd been asked to move to the back because she was disturbing other passengers, even though her children were completely well-behaved. An elderly woman with a walker who'd been treated like she was faking her disability. A young man wearing a turban who'd been randomly selected for additional screening on every single flight for 5 years. Story after story after story. People who'd experienced discrimination in the air and convinced themselves it was normal. That it was just how things were. That they should just accept it and move on. Flight 2447 told them they didn't have to accept it anymore. The legal consequences for Claire Dawson and Captain Hayes were severe. Claire was sentenced to 18 months in federal prison for assault and child endangerment. Hayes lost his pilot's license permanently. The FAA's investigation revealed a pattern of behavior so extensive that it prompted a complete review of how pilots with repeated complaints were being handled across the industry. But here's what's interesting. Jonathan and Alyssa didn't just walk away after getting justice. They could have. They'd won. The bad guys were punished. The system was reformed. They could have gone back to their lives. Instead, they created something bigger. 6 months after Flight 2447, they founded the Family Flight Foundation. Its mission was simple: provide free legal representation to any passenger who experienced discrimination on an aircraft. Any airline, any circumstance. If you were treated unfairly because of your race, your religion, your appearance, your disability, or any other factor, they would fight for you. People said it was crazy, that they'd be overwhelmed with frivolous complaints, that it would bankrupt them. In the first 2 years, they handled 902 cases. They won every single one. Not every case went to trial. Most airlines, faced with the Foundation's legal team and the public relations nightmare of another viral discrimination story, settled quickly. But whether it was a settlement or a courtroom victory, the message was clear: passengers had rights. And those rights would be protected. The college student who live-streamed the original incident, Marcus, turned his footage into a documentary. He called it 35,000 Feet, Injustice in the Sky. It won awards at Sundance, Toronto, and Cannes. It was shortlisted for an Academy Award. More importantly, it was watched by over 100 million people worldwide. The documentary didn't just replay the viral video. It dug deeper. It interviewed other passengers who'd experienced discrimination. It showed the training sessions Atlas Air implemented. It followed Claire Dawson to prison and interviewed her about how her own biases had destroyed her life. It talked to Captain Hayes, who broke down on camera admitting he'd let power and pride blind him to his own prejudice. It was uncomfortable to watch. It made people confront their own assumptions. But it started conversations that needed to happen. Congress took notice. Within a year, they passed the Aviation Accountability Act, requiring every airline to publicly report discrimination incidents, investigation outcomes, and training compliance. No more hiding complaints. No more quiet settlements that buried patterns of abuse. The data that emerged was shocking. Before Flight 2447 and the reforms it sparked, discrimination complaints in aviation were running at about 15,000 per year across all U.S. carriers. Within 2 years of the new policies, complaints dropped to 4,500. That's a 70% decrease. Not because discrimination stopped overnight, but because airlines finally had real incentives to prevent it, and passengers finally had real protections when it happened. Atlas Air's transformation was the most dramatic. Pre-Flight 2447, they'd been averaging about 20 complaints per month. After the reforms, in the first year, complaints actually went up to 40 per month because people felt safe reporting them. But by the second year, they dropped to 5 per month. And by the third year, they were down to fewer than 2. The company's reputation shifted from the airline where the CEO's wife got slapped to the safest airline in America, particularly for families, particularly for mothers traveling alone, particularly for people who'd previously felt like they had to be on guard every time they flew. And the business results? Atlas Air's stock didn't just recover, it soared. Within 6 months of the incident, profits were up 25%. Turns out, treating people with dignity is actually great for business. Who knew? But the real measure of success wasn't in stock prices or profit margins. It was in the small moments that most people never saw. Like the flight attendant who noticed a nervous Muslim woman and went out of her way to make her feel welcome, bringing her extra water and chatting with her about her kids. Like the pilot who came out of the cockpit to personally greet a disabled veteran and thank him for his service before takeoff. Like the gate agent who saw a tired single mom struggling with luggage and a toddler, and not only helped carry their bags but upgraded them to first class with a smile. These weren't isolated incidents. They became the culture. Because when you train people to see passengers as human beings instead of problems to manage, something shifts. Empathy becomes automatic. Kindness becomes normal. 3 years after Flight 2447, Alyssa and Jonathan were interviewed on 60 Minutes. Luna, now a happy 3-year-old, played with blocks in the corner of the room while they talked. "Do you ever regret not identifying yourself earlier?" the interviewer asked Alyssa. "If you'd just shown them who you were, none of this would have happened." Alyssa was quiet for a moment, considering the question carefully. "That's exactly the point," she finally said. "I shouldn't have had to show them who I was. My dignity as a passenger, as a human being, shouldn't depend on who I'm married to or what symbol is on my boarding pass. Every person on that plane deserved to be treated with respect." The only difference was that I had the power to demand accountability. Most people don't. That's what we're trying to change. Jonathan added, if my wife hadn't been on that flight, if it had been any other young mother, Claire Dawson would probably still be working. Captain Hayes would still be flying. Those 7 discrimination complaints in his file would have turned into 8, 9, 10. The system would have protected them and failed the passengers. That's what was broken. That's what we're fixing. Do you think it's fixed? The interviewer asked. No, they both said at the same time. But it's better, Alyssa continued. And it's getting better every day. That's all we can ask for. Progress. Not perfection, but real, measurable, meaningful progress. Today, if you fly on Atlas Air, or on most major airlines, for that matter, you'll see that passenger bill of rights posted in the cabin. You'll notice flight attendants who've been trained differently. You'll experience a culture that's shifted, even if just a little bit. And if you're a young mother traveling alone with a baby, you'll probably be treated with a little more patience, a little more understanding, a little more humanity. Because somewhere, at 35,000 feet, the memory of Flight 2447 is still flying. Luna is 7 years old now. She travels frequently with her parents, flying all over the world. And every single flight crew that sees her knows who she is. Not because she's the CEO's daughter, but because she's the baby who changed an industry. Flight attendants stop to say hello. Pilots come out to meet her. Gate agents smile and wave. Not because they have to, because they're genuinely happy to see her. Because she represents something important, proof that one moment of injustice, confronted with courage and accountability, can create lasting change. Last year, on the 5-year anniversary of Flight 2447, Alyssa and Luna flew from Atlanta to Los Angeles. They sat in first class, seat 3A, the same seat where it all happened. The flight attendant working that cabin was new, young, fresh out of training. She brought them drinks and snacks, chatted warmly about Luna's stuffed elephant, made sure they were comfortable. As they were landing, the flight attendant stopped by one more time. Mrs. Morgan, she said quietly, I just wanted to say thank you. I went through the passenger dignity program during my training. We studied what happened on your flight. It's why I applied to work here, because I wanted to be part of an airline that actually cares about doing the right thing. Alyssa smiled, squeezed the young woman's hand. Thank you for seeing passengers the way they deserve to be seen. Always, the flight attendant said. And she meant it. That's the real legacy of Flight 2447. Not the viral video. Not the dramatic confrontation. Not even the reforms and the policies and the programs. The real legacy is in the hearts and minds of people who learned that silence in the face of injustice is a choice. That power without accountability is dangerous. That every person, regardless of who they are or where they're sitting or what they look like, deserves to be treated with basic human dignity. It's in the mother who now flies without fear. It's in the businessman who's no longer questioned about his ticket. It's in the flight attendant who chooses kindness. It's in the pilot who sees passengers as people, not problems. It's in everyone who watched that video and asked themselves, would I have spoken up? Would I have intervened? Or would I have been part of the problem? Because here's the thing about that day in Atlanta. It didn't just expose one flight attendant's cruelty or one pilot's bias. It exposed something much bigger. It held up a mirror to an entire industry, to a culture of casual discrimination that had been normalized for so long that people stopped seeing it. And when you finally see something, really see it, you can't unsee it. You can't go back to pretending it's normal. You have to change. Flight 2447 changed everything because one woman refused to be silent. Because one man used his power to demand accountability instead of covering it up. Because thousands of people watched and decided they didn't want to live in a world where that kind of treatment was acceptable. The quietest woman in the cabin became the loudest lesson the world needed to hear. Not because she shouted, but because she stood firm. And when the moment came, when she had the power to demand justice, she didn't just demand it for herself. She demanded it for everyone. That's how you change the world. Not with grand speeches or dramatic gestures, but with quiet courage, unwavering dignity, and the simple, radical belief that every person deserves to be treated like they matter. Because they do. Every single one. At 35,000 feet and everywhere else. Sometimes, life reminds us that power isn't about titles or uniforms, it's about integrity. That flight showed the world that dignity has no class, and respect has no color. If you believe in standing for what's right, even when no one else does, hit that like button, subscribe, and share this story with someone who needs to remember that quiet strength can change the world.